That morning, the sky was clear and the light spilled gently through the kitchen window of a small wooden house on the edge of Grand Junction, Colorado. Evelyn, 68 years old, her silver hair tied neatly with a faded blue ribbon, stood still. In her backyard. She wasn't wearing a coat. In her hand, she held a ceramic cup, the tea inside long gone cold. Her eyes were wet, not from the wind, not from the weather, but from something deeper, something quieter. There was no rain that day. But inside Evelyn, a storm had quietly begun. No one would have guessed Evelyn was struggling. She had spent decades as a head nurse at the local hospital, known for her strength and steady hands. When her husband passed, she didn't cry in front of the children. When her grown kids moved out of state, she smiled and told them, "Live your life, sweethearts. I'm just fine." And for a long time, she believed that. She had her routines, tea at sunrise, phone calls left on voicemail, television news playing in the background. It all seemed manageable until that morning when the phone rang. Her oldest friend from high school, someone Evelyn hadn't spoken to in over 3 years, had died by suicide. Depression, the message said. Quiet, unseen. Evelyn stared at the phone after hanging up, her tea untouched. Then, without thinking, she walked barefoot into the yard and stood under the wide, cloudless sky. She didn't sob. She didn't scream. But the tears came, and they didn't stop. She wasn't just mourning her friend. She was mourning something inside herself she hadn't realized was missing. The news cracked something open, and for the first time in years, Evelyn couldn't lie to herself. She, too, was fading, not physically, not in the obvious ways, but inside. Emotionally. Spiritually. She'd been floating through her days, calm on the surface but hollow underneath. There's something about anxiety in older age that no one talks about. It doesn't always look like panic attacks or tears. Sometimes it's just silence. It's the feeling of being disconnected from the world you once moved through with purpose. It's waking up and feeling like you're watching your life from a distance. It's not forgetting who you are, but slowly losing interest in remembering. This story doesn't begin with meditation or some enlightened breakthrough. It begins in a much more ordinary and painful place, the quiet realization that you've lost touch with yourself. And for Evelyn, that realization came not in a therapist's office or a spiritual retreat, but in the backyard of her own home, tea in hand, grief in her chest, and no idea what came next. If you've ever felt like you're quietly slipping away, if you've ever looked around and wondered, when did I stop feeling alive? Stay with this story. Evelyn isn't a guru or a monk. She's not here to preach or pretend. She's just someone who, at 68, learned how to breathe again. Not just with her lungs, but with her heart. Maybe you're ready to remember how to breathe, too. If so, this is where we begin. Chapter 1, When Loneliness is No Longer a Word. Evelyn used to believe she understood loneliness. After all, she'd experienced it before, when her husband passed away 10 years ago, when her children left for college, when holidays came and went with only polite phone calls to mark their passing. But nothing prepared her for the kind of emptiness that began settling in during the quiet years after retirement. It was different this time. It wasn't just about being alone. It was about no longer feeling real in her own life. She followed the same rhythm every day. Wake up at 6. Make tea. Open the curtains. Feed the cat. Scroll through headlines she barely read. Listen to the voice messages from her children, always apologetic for missing her call, always promising to visit soon. She'd smile at their voices, murmur something back to the silence, and then go about the rest of her day. She baked more than she ate. Watered the plants even when it rained. Folded laundry she'd forgotten she washed. And when night fell, she'd lay in bed with the TV humming in the background, not for entertainment, but for company. It was a slow fade, not a sharp drop. That's what made it dangerous. There was no dramatic breaking point, no obvious cry for help. Evelyn didn't even know anything was wrong. She still laughed with the cashier at the grocery store. Still sent birthday cards. Still wore lipstick. On Sundays. But inside, something was dissolving, a soft erosion of meaning, of identity, of connection. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. There were no words that quite fit. Just a growing weight in her chest and the whispering question that haunted her each evening, is this all there is now? Then came the phone call. A single sentence shattered the illusion of "I'm fine" she'd clung to for years. Her best friend from high school, Melanie, had died. She had taken her own life after a long struggle with depression. Evelyn hadn't spoken to her in over 3 years. The guilt was immediate and sharp. But even more than guilt was the shock, the way it hit Evelyn that Melanie had felt what she, too, had been feeling. That same quiet slipping, that same lonely ache that no one saw. The night after the call, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the dresser mirror. She didn't cry. She just looked at herself for a long time, trying to remember who she had once been. Her reflection stared back with a tired sort of softness, as if asking, when did we stop living and start just existing? That was the moment something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a lightning bolt of clarity. It was just a thought, small but powerful. If I don't do something now, I might disappear like Melanie did. Not in the physical sense, but in the quiet, unseen way people fade when no one notices, not even themselves. The next morning, she pulled an old notebook from the kitchen drawer and began to write. Not a diary entry. Not a letter. Just a sentence: I think I've forgotten how to breathe. She stared at those words for a long time. Then, slowly, she picked up her tea, walked outside into the early morning sun, and sat in the chair where the light hit just right. She closed her eyes and, without knowing what else to do, she took one breath. Then another. It was the first time in years that her breathing wasn't just keeping her alive, it was calling her back to life. Chapter 2, A Different Look at Suffering. A week after the funeral, Evelyn found herself in the corner of the local library. It was a grey Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed unsure of whether to rain or not. She hadn't meant to be there. She was on her way home from the post office when something in her stirred, an instinct, maybe, and she pulled into the small parking lot without really thinking. She walked slowly through the aisles, running her fingers along the spines of books she didn't intend to read, stopping only when she reached a shelf marked Philosophy and Spirituality. It wasn't a section she'd ever explored before. In her younger years, she might have brushed past it without a second glance, but that day, she stood still. Something about the quiet promise of those titles, Peace in a Frantic World, the heart of the Buddha's teaching, when things fall apart, felt like an invitation. Or maybe, a gentle nudge. Her eyes landed on a worn paperback with a cracked spine, The Art of Happiness. She pulled it out and flipped to a random page. Her eyes fell on a line that read, Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. She read it again, slowly, letting the words settle. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the usual resistance rise in her chest. She felt curiosity. At home that night, she read until her eyes blurred. The words were simple, but they cut through something inside her. It was the first time she saw her pain not as a personal failure, but as part of the human experience. The book spoke of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, how suffering is part of life, how it often stems from craving and attachment, and how, with awareness and compassion, that suffering can be eased. It was such a different way of thinking. Evelyn had always been taught to either fight her feelings or hide them. Keep busy. Stay productive. Don't dwell. She'd spent a lifetime trying to control her emotions, to avoid pain, to stay strong. But now, sitting in her quiet kitchen, with the book open in her lap, she wondered if strength might look like something else entirely. Maybe it looked like softening instead of hardening. Maybe it meant turning toward her pain instead of away from it. That evening, she remembered a memory from years ago, her daughter, Claire, at age 6, running barefoot in the backyard, falling hard on the pavement. Evelyn had rushed over, scooped her up, and held her close while Claire sobbed. It hurts, Mama, the little girl had cried, and Evelyn had said, I know, sweetheart. I know. Just let it hurt for a little while. She had never said that to herself. So she tried. For the first time, she sat with her own pain, not trying to explain it or solve it or push it away. She simply acknowledged it. The loneliness. The fear. The ache of fading into the background. It hurts, she whispered to herself. And that's okay. She didn't feel better right away. But she felt something different, like a small opening in a tightly shut room. Over the next few days, she began reading more about mindfulness. The idea of observing her thoughts and feelings without judgment intrigued her. It felt strange at first. Foreign. But it also felt like truth. She tried it in small moments, sitting with her tea in the morning, noticing the warmth of the cup in her hands, listening to the quiet creak of the floorboards, watching the way sunlight danced across the countertop. She wasn't fixing anything. She was just noticing. And somehow, that noticing began to create a kind of space inside her, a gentle pause between the feeling and the reaction point. One morning, as she stood at the sink, a thought rose up out of nowhere. Maybe she didn't have to be okay all the time. Maybe she didn't need to earn her rest, her peace, her softness. Maybe she was allowed to just be a human being, wounded, aging, still learning, and that was enough. Suffering, she was beginning to understand, didn't come from the pain itself. It came from the resistance to that pain. From the need to explain it, justify it, erase it. And now, she was learning to let it be. Not to indulge in it or wallow, but to give it space. To stop fighting so hard against her own heart. Later that week, she wrote in her notebook, "I'm not broken. I'm just in pain. And that pain is asking me to listen." She paused. And then, almost without thinking, she wrote one more line, "Maybe this is how healing begins." Chapter 3, The Breath of Life. Evelyn had never paid much attention to her breath before. It was just something that happened in the background, like the hum of the refrigerator or the ticking of the wall clock in the hallway, always there, always unnoticed. But now, with everything she had been reading, she kept coming across the same word, breath. In Buddhist teachings, it was called the anchor. A place to return to when the mind drifted, when fear or sadness rose like a tide. It sounded simple, almost too simple. But after decades of carrying unspoken grief and quiet anxiety, simplicity felt like a mercy. She decided to try it late one evening, when sleep refused to come and her thoughts kept circling like restless birds. She sat at the edge of her bed, turned off the bedside lamp, and listened to the dark. At first, her mind kept chattering, lists, regrets, old conversations, the ache of what had been lost. But she remembered something she'd read the night before: when the mind wanders, return to the breath. Over and over again. That is the practice. So she closed her eyes, placed a hand over her chest, and began to notice the rise and fall of her breathing. It felt shallow at first, uneven. Her chest tightened with the effort, as if even noticing the breath made it harder. But she stayed with it, gently. She didn't force anything. She just kept paying attention. In. Out. In. Out. After a few minutes, something softened. Her breath began to slow, deepening without her trying to control it. Her shoulders dropped. Her jaw unclenched. It wasn't a dramatic change. It was more like an exhale she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. In that quiet moment, Evelyn felt herself arrive, not somewhere new, but back into her own body. The next morning, she tried it again. This time, she sat in her sunroom with a cushion she pulled from the old couch, a small candle flickering nearby. She followed a technique called 4-7-8 breathing: inhale for 4 counts, hold for 7, exhale for 8. It felt awkward at first, but then something in her clicked. As she exhaled slowly, she imagined releasing tension, not just in her body, but in the places inside her that had been clenched tight for years. She pictured the anxiety melting away like frost in sunlight. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Not because the world was different, but because she was different, just a little more present, a little more grounded. In the weeks that followed, her breathing practice became a daily ritual. She didn't call it meditation at first. That word had always felt too formal, too distant. Instead, she simply told herself, "I'm going to sit and breathe for a while." She chose a small corner by the window, where the morning light came through soft and warm. She placed a folded blanket there, a small bell from her travels to New Mexico, and a photograph of her and her husband smiling in the kitchen from 30 years ago. It became her sanctuary, not a place to escape life, but a place to meet it more fully. One morning, she tried a body scan meditation, as suggested in one of her books. She lay down on the carpet, closed her eyes, and brought her attention slowly from her feet upward. She noticed the tension in her calves, the stiffness in her hips, the heaviness in her chest. She didn't try to fix anything. She just noticed. When she reached her heart, she imagined it opening like a window, letting in air after years of being shut. And without meaning to, she began to cry, not because she was sad, but because she finally felt connected to herself again. That moment marked something. Not a resolution, not an end, but a shift. Breathing was no longer just survival, it had become a form of returning. Every time Evelyn sat with her breath, she felt a little less scattered, a little less afraid. There were still moments of panic, still nights when memories kept her awake, but now she had a place to come home to. Herself. She began to notice other things too. How her breath changed when she was anxious, quick and shallow, as if bracing for impact. And how it steadied when she slowed down and paid attention. She noticed how much time she used to spend trying to fix her feelings, to wrestle them into silence. Now, she simply breathed through them. Not to get rid of them, but to make room for them. They no longer held her hostage. One day, while journaling. After a morning practice, she wrote a single sentence: "My breath is where I meet my life." She underlined it 3 times. That line stayed with her. It reminded her that every inhale was a new chance and every exhale a release. There was no final destination, no mountain summit of peace to reach. There was only this moment and the breath that carried her through it. Evelyn wasn't searching for perfection anymore. She was learning to stay, to breathe. And in doing so, she discovered something she hadn't known she'd lost: her own presence. Her own voice beneath the noise. The steady rhythm of being alive. Chapter 4, A Space of Peace. It started with the smallest gesture, opening the whole closet to put away a winter scarf, only to realize she hadn't worn half the coats inside in over 10 years. Evelyn stood there for a moment, running her hand along the sleeves of things she no longer needed, and felt something stir inside her. It wasn't just the coats. It was everything. The forgotten books, the dusty frames, the kitchen drawers filled with receipts and buttons and pens that didn't work. Her home wasn't messy, but it was full, and in a way that mirrored how she'd felt inside for years: crowded, cluttered, weighed down. She began slowly, without a plan. One drawer one morning. One shelf the next. There was no urgency, only instinct. Each time she let go of something, she felt a little lighter. Not just because the space was clearer, but because she no longer needed those things to feel rooted. She realized she had been holding onto objects like lifelines, proof of a life once lived, of a woman who had once been needed and busy and constantly moving. But now, what she needed was the opposite. She needed space. Quiet. Air clearing. Space in her home quickly became something more than a task, it became a ritual. As she moved through each room, she noticed what made her feel heavy and what brought her peace. She stopped thinking in terms of usefulness or sentimentality and started asking herself a new kind of question: does this help me breathe easier? That question changed everything. When the decluttering was done, she found herself gravitating toward one particular corner of her sunroom, where morning light filtered in and painted warm gold across the wooden floor. There she created what she called her quiet space. It wasn't fancy. A folded blanket to sit on. A small wooden table with a candle, a photo of her and her husband on their wedding day, and a tiny potted plant her granddaughter had given her. That little corner became her refuge. Not a place to escape from life, but to reconnect with it. She began starting each morning there, before the rest of the world intruded. She would light the candle, place her hands on her lap, and sit in stillness. Sometimes she meditated. Sometimes she simply breathed and watched the light shift across the floor. Sometimes she cried without knowing why. But no matter what happened in that space, she always left it feeling more like herself, and slowly, something shifted. The peace she found in that corner began to spill into other parts of her day. She noticed herself moving more gently through the house, speaking more softly to herself, responding to stress with more patience. When anxiety crept in, as it still did from time to time, she would pause and return to her breath, as if the air itself could lead her back to safety. And often, it did. Evelyn began to see her surroundings as part of her inner life, not separate from it. Her home was no longer just where she lived. It became a reflection of how she was healing. Every object she kept had meaning. Every bit of space she created allowed her to sit more fully in her own presence. She didn't need noise or distraction. She didn't need to be busy to feel alive. What she needed, what she had always needed, was permission to be still, and now, in that quiet corner, with the scent of lavender and the soft flicker of candlelight, she gave herself that permission every single day. Chapter 5, The One Who Returns from Within. There was no grand moment of arrival, no dramatic transformation. Evelyn didn't wake up one day suddenly free of fear or loneliness. The change was quieter than that, like the steady unfolding of a flower, unnoticed until it was in full bloom. But over time, something undeniable had shifted. She no longer moved through her days in a haze. Her steps felt more intentional, her voice more rooted, her silences less heavy. She was still the same woman in many ways, still living alone in the same modest house, still missing people she had lost, still occasionally waking in the middle of the night with old memories pressing at the edges of her mind. But now, she met those moments with a gentleness she hadn't known she was capable of. It was during a local community event at the library that someone first asked her to lead a short mindfulness session. A younger woman, maybe in her 40s, had overheard Evelyn talking about breathwork and meditation and said, "You should teach us that. You speak in a way that calms people." Evelyn laughed softly and brushed off the idea at first. But something inside her stirred again, the same quiet nudge she'd felt at the library shelves months earlier. The next week, she agreed. They started as small circles of older women, most of them widows or retired nurses, school teachers, librarians, women who, like Evelyn, had spent their lives taking care of everyone but themselves. They gathered in the sunroom of the library every Thursday afternoon, sitting in folding chairs with mugs of tea and open hearts. Evelyn didn't lecture. She didn't pretend to be an expert. She simply shared her story of what it meant to slow down, to breathe, to befriend your own mind after decades of pushing it aside. Sometimes, women cried as they listened. Sometimes, they laughed. Sometimes, they sat in long, comfortable silence. Evelyn would guide them through a simple breathing practice or a short body scan, and afterward, they'd linger just to sit together, to feel less alone. One woman, a 76-year-old named Doris, once said, "I always thought healing was for the young. I didn't know it was still possible for me." Evelyn took her hand and replied, "I thought that, too. Until I began." There was a stillness in Evelyn now, but it wasn't the stillness of emptiness. It was the stillness of someone who had gone deep into her own pain and returned with something sacred. She no longer looked for peace outside herself. She carried it with her. Not in every moment, not perfectly, but consistently, quietly, and with great care. When she sat in her sunroom alone, or walked slowly through the neighborhood trails in the evening light, she often whispered a simple phrase under her breath. "I'm here. I'm still here." And every time she said it, it felt less like a declaration and more like a homecoming. Evelyn never set out to become someone new. She simply wanted to feel alive again, to remember what it was like to belong in her own skin, to sit with herself without flinching. Looking back, she often marveled at how the most profound shifts began with the simplest acts, noticing her breath, clearing a drawer, sitting still for 5 quiet minutes. There were no miracles, only choices. But those choices, made with care and consistency, became the bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. Her story was never about escaping pain, but about learning how to meet it with softness. There were still days when grief rose unexpectedly, when memories of her husband would pass through like weather, when loneliness crept in without warning. But she no longer fought those moments. She welcomed them with the same compassion she would offer a dear friend. There was space for all of it now, the joy, the sadness, the uncertainty, the calm. Nothing needed to be erased. Nothing needed to be perfect. What she learned through this journey wasn't a list of steps or a final destination, but a way of being. A way of listening. A way of loving herself in the small, ordinary details of daily life. In lighting a candle. In making tea slowly. In whispering a mantra when her heart felt tight. In breathing through anxiety instead of being swallowed by it. She began to understand that healing wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about returning, gently, bravely, to the person she had always been, beneath the noise. Sometimes, Evelyn would sit in her quiet corner, hands folded in her lap, and think about the women she'd met in her mindfulness group. Each of them carried stories of loss, fear, tenderness, and strength. And each of them, like her, had found something sacred in simply being seen and heard. Not fixed. Not rescued. Just honored. There's a quiet kind of power in learning to stay with your breath, your emotions, your truth. Evelyn had found that power not in a temple or a therapist's office, but in the sanctuary of her own heart. And that, she realized, was available to anyone. At any age. In any place. We don't need to escape our lives to find peace. We need only to turn toward them with kindness. If you've made it this far, maybe you too are looking for a way home. Maybe something in Evelyn's story felt familiar. If it did, hold that gently. Know that you're not alone, and that it is never too late to begin again, not by changing everything, but by pausing long enough to hear yourself breathe. That's where it starts. That's where peace begins. And if this story has touched you, even in the smallest way, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who might need it. Together, we can create a space where stories like Evelyn's are not only told, but felt, and where healing, no matter how quiet, is always possible.